The World Beyond the Headlines lecture series is a project of the University of Chicago Center for International Studies.
Tonight we welcome Carlos Martinez to the University of Chicago. Mr. Martinez is co-editor of the book Venezuela Speaks, Voices from the Grassroots, a book that is unique in its unfiltered bottom-up perspective on Venezuela's incredibly diverse social movements that have resulted in the country's bloodless uprising and reorganization. This is a perspective that has largely been lost in international mainstream media, which is focused predominantly on Venezuela's president, Hugo Chávez. Carlos Martinez has been involved in Latin America's solidarity work for many years. He recently served as the Caracas-based Venezuela program director for the human rights organization Global Exchange. His articles have been published in both Monthly Review and Common Dreams. Please join me in welcoming Carlos Martinez.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming out and making it here in time, even with the Obama mania or whatever. I barely just made it on time, actually, so that's why I'm saying that. Which I did not expect. I did not know Obama was going to be here when I was here, so it's a bit hectic getting down here right now. I guess just to start off, usually I like to read a little excerpt from the book, but to begin, but I'd like to just explain a little bit about what this project is about before actually doing that, and where it kind of emerged from, and the reason for doing it, and also just to speak a little bit to sort of, I guess, the general story of Venezuela that most of us, or not most of us, but many of us are familiar with, so that I can make sure that everybody's kind of familiar to a certain degree about where the discussion is about Venezuela. I, as was mentioned, worked with Global Exchange, an organization based in San Francisco. And through Global Exchange was able to actually direct a program through which they run called Reality Tours, which the idea of Reality Tours is actually just to bring delegations, a lot of times of students, but also of all types of people, to different countries throughout the world to learn about what's going on in that country, to actually connect with grassroots organizations, civil society, and also to learn about the effects of U.S. policy upon those countries. So I had the fortune of actually being able to work for Global Exchange as the Venezuela program director, and through that moved to Venezuela and directed that program for a year in Caracas. Before actually doing that, I already kind of had actually gone to Venezuela before. I had some friends that were already living down there, actually, who I ended up co-authoring this book with, Jojo Farrell and Michael Fox. And after a time of being there, actually didn't take very long, we all kind of, really began to recognize how distant the dominant discourse around Venezuela or debates even around Venezuela that we were seeing in the United States, how distant that was from the reality that we were actually encountering in the communities that we were connecting with, and in the communities that we were, in many cases, able to bring people from the United States to actually visit. And it became pretty stark in contrast. And we sort of, I think any of us who were living down there kind of wanted to figure out, well, how do we communicate this? And there's been different approaches that people have taken in trying to do that. Actually, the inspiration for this book partially came from actually a book that I encountered, which was a collection of interviews with Central American revolutionary leaders. This old book that came out in the 80s and found it at this used bookstore, and I thought it was a really fascinating kind of format because it was just this kind of interviews that gave kind of a more raw, unedited sort of vision of how these people perceive themselves, of their movements, as opposed to someone simply, or not simply, but someone analyzing their situation and speaking for them. And I kind of felt like that's something that was needed from Venezuela. And so there was documentaries that were being made, and that plenty that continue to get made about Venezuela. But something that hadn't come out was a book that was focused upon grassroots organizing in Venezuela, upon social movements, and it really allowed for participants in those movements to express themselves and to speak for themselves. And that was what we found sort of one of the best ways to be able to communicate what was taking place in Venezuela, and also to really get at the incredible complexity of what's going on in Venezuela. And furthermore, to actually get to a place where we can actually discuss Venezuela based upon, I think, a more authentic understanding of what's happening, rather than maintaining it in this kind of duality that we have here in the US, which is either one of demonizing what's taking place in Venezuela or idealizing it. And sort of attempting to at least ground the discussion in a bit more of reality, which the reality is complex. So that's sort of where the vision for this book came from. So it's a collection of interviews with people from a broad spectrum of social movements, and we really try to approach or cast as wide a net as possible. Of course, with you know, the intentional bias of making sure this book is focused on historically marginalized sectors of society. So people that have historically not really been part, or that are not participating necessarily in the political process, people that have been organizing the social movements maybe for many years, in some cases before Chavez came into power, in other cases after Chavez came into power. And so that includes everything from the Afro-Venezuelan movement, the indigenous movement, the women's movement, the labor movement, community media, just a really broad spectrum of things, which was actually just necessary to really capture what was taking place there. And it actually ends up that the book is 18 chapters, which is sort of a lot, but we realized that was sort of the only way we could actually get to trying to present a diversity of voices, and also trying to stay away from this idea that each interview that we did was going to sum up that whole movement. So that was definitely something that came up. And so, for instance, we have chapters with a couple people from the labor movement, and a couple people representing the women's movement. We found that this was sort of a great way of just letting people tell their own story. So to actually do that, I'd like to now actually just read a small excerpt from one of these interviews. Just to give some context, this woman is Iraide Morocoima. She is a participant in a movement called the Urban Land Committees. The Urban Land Committees are a form of social organization that were actually created by the Chavez government. And so this is an important kind of distinction that I think kind of emerged after really looking at the breadth of all these movements, was to see that there was many organizations or movements that had their own forms of social organization prior to maybe Chavez, or just, for instance, like labor unions, right? And then there's other forms of organization that were inspired by the Chavez government or even created by the Chavez government. CTUs, the Comités de Tierra Urbana, the urban land committees are one of those. Another one is the communal councils, which we can talk more about as well. Urban land committees were created as a result of a law passed actually fairly early in the Chavez administration. I believe the law was passed in 99. And with the intention of providing a form of organization by which people that had been living in the slum communities, or what they call in Venezuela the barrios, which basically are the homes that people have been building for themselves, surrounding many of the major cities, particularly Caracas, for the last few decades, right, since the second half of the 20th century, as there was a mass exodus of people leaving the countryside and starting to populate the urban territory and starting to build these whole communities, and squatting land and doing that, and building these whole communities for themselves, and which is the primary way that most Venezuelans actually live. Most Venezuelans live in these barrios. So this this law, which brought into creation these urban land committees, was a way for families to actually come together and to actually demarcate the territory that they had squatted, in many cases decades prior, to find a way to actually have a legal mechanism where they were able to actually have that land recognized as being owned by them, which was an incredibly historic kind of initiative for these people that had been in a situation where they weren't necessarily being kicked off of the land, they weren't being persecuted by the governments necessarily, they weren't being stripped from it, but they also weren't recognized as legitimately being settlers or people residing on that land. So the urban land committees kind of emerged as a way for people to do that. And through that, there was actually a large percentage of people that were able to get recognition in urban land titles. Now, there was a number of people that had been more recent kind of arrivals to the barrios, or people that were still continuing to actually arrive to the barrios and to be building their communities. There's a lot of, for instance, people that are coming from other countries surrounding Venezuela, like Colombia, that are still coming in and building new barrios, and this is a process that is still continuing. And there was sort of still this unresolved issue for many of these people that weren't, through the urban land committees, able to actually gain title to their land. So a movement kind of emerged out of these people that weren't able to do that to try to push for further land reform within the city. And a particular group that formed was called the Pioneers, or in Spanish, the Pioneros. And they kind of took inspiration from sort of the land occupation style of tactics that had been developing amongst the landless workers movements in Brazil. And the Pioneros really moved forward with actually doing occupations of city land as a way to, at the very minimum, to bring attention to their issue, and at best to try to actually get the city or the local government to recognize them as people as legally being able to have a right to that to the city is kind of their discourse, having a right to be able to access city land, and that everybody should have just a dignified housing and access to it, and that if there is an unused plot of land, that should be used for housing. So actually this, I think, kind of little excerpt speaks a lot to the political process of Venezuela, which is kind of what I want to get to. Yeah. This section we call the revolution within the revolution. We are carrying out a revolution within a revolution. Not everyone who supports Chavez wants to make socialism a reality. In the barrios, this process towards socialism is very common because it is a process of equality. No one is better than the other. Yes, it's true that the mainstream media has often attempted to individualize us, but we continue to say that we're all the same. It is important for people to understand that we are fighting on two fronts: the struggle against the opposition so that they don't alter our goals, and the struggle against the government bureaucrats to support large financial capital who continue to give these lands to the large construction companies. That's why we say this is a process of revolution within the revolution. I'll keep it there for now. So there's a lot of concepts that are just mentioned in that really are themes and that emerge throughout the entire book. And actually, I should take a step back. I'm realizing necessarily talk about who Chavez is, right, and kind of where that all came from, or where this all came from, right? So just to give a kind of general, broad, quick overview of Venezuela. Chavez really, and this is actually another really important, significant part of the story that emerges from everybody's narratives in Venezuela that is participating in the political process there. Kind of the recognition that Chavez, and this is obvious, Chavez did not come about one day and kind of start talking about socialism and then turn everybody into a socialist zombie, which is sort of the way that it gets conceived here, right? Chavez, this radical kind of leader, comes with this radical rhetoric, and all of a sudden people buy into it, and they bought into this, this dogmatic sort of leader and are brainwashed or something. There's variations, but that's sort of one, I think, of the ideas, or that he simply, has wrestled control from the people and is, but that doesn't take into account, of course, that Chavez has an incredible amount of popularity. So that needs to get taken into account, and usually in these ways of talking about Venezuela. What kind of a lot of people can speak to is the fact that Chavez is really a reflection of a much larger process, or a much larger history in Venezuela, which really most people, what they kind of talk about or reference consistently is 1989 with the Caracazo. The Caracazo, which references Caracas, was a riot that spread all throughout the country. That was met with tremendous government repression. At that time, the government was under the President Carlos Andrés Pérez, who, interestingly enough, Carlos Andrés Pérez, back in the 70s, in his first administration, was sort of more of a populist leader himself, who prided himself upon the development of oil. And actually, in many ways, Chavez's rhetoric kind of reflects Carlos Andrés' rhetoric in his first presidency in the 1970s. Carlos Andrés Pérez's second presidency, however, in the era of the 80s, was the moment in which neoliberalism really started to take off. The idea of, privatizing national industry, deregulating, and dropping tariffs to allow for international imports, all those types of things, which Carlos Andrés Pérez in that time really moved forward in that process. So in February of 1989, he signed a neoliberal package with the International Monetary Fund, which basically paved the way for a tremendous increase in oil prices domestically for Venezuelans, and also, and subsequently, tremendous deregulation, an increase in prices of transport, specifically of bus price hikes, and also food. So literally overnight, with the signing of this deal, Venezuelans saw the price and cost of food and transportation double and triple, or even quadruple or more so in costs, which was met, obviously, because this was already a time of deteriorating economic conditions, with a tremendous outcry. And some of the stories talk about how students really were the first to lead the kind of uprising at that moment, but it really spread nationwide. Estimates of repression vary to this day, and there's kind of a committee of the disappeared and things like that are still looking for more evidence as to what the amount of people assassinated by the government was at that time. But they vary between the hundreds to the thousands of people. Chavez at this time was in the military. He had apparently been sick the week of the Caracazo, so didn't participate himself, allegedly, in the repression. But noticed it in his own kind of stories. He talks about how that was sort of a turning moment for himself, as seeing that he could no longer be a military person supporting a repressive regime that would massacre thousands or hundreds, whatever, people. It was after this that Chavez goes on to form basically secret initiative within the military. He forms a clandestine movement called the Bolivarian Movement 2000, the Revolutionary Bolivarian Movement 2000, Movimiento MBR 2000. And through this starts to really develop a strong leadership cadre of other military leaders who are sympathetic towards the idea that there does need to be a definitive change from the political system, which, by the way, at that time was, for the 50 years up until Chavez, well, actually before Chavez came into power, but for about half century was essentially was a rigid, even maybe more so than our own country, rigid two-party system, in the sense that it was a power-sharing agreement that was actually created by two of the parties that took over from the Marco Pérez Jiménez regime in 58, which were Acción Democrática and COPEI, which is a kind of Christian democratic, more right-wing. Acción Democrático, sort of more like the left, kind of Democrat type of thing. Those two parties had a power-sharing agreement called the Punto Fijo Pact. So this kind of whole era is called Punto Fijismo, and they shared power for all those decades. And sort of what that Caracazo represented was a crisis, not simply economic crisis, but also a crisis of political legitimacy of this two-party system. So there was a number of leaders that Chavez was able to get inside that were able to basically that sympathize with the idea that there need to be a break with this. That whole kind of thing continued to crumble. There was actually a second attempt. Well, so actually no. Take a step back. Chavez then in '92 attempts an overthrow of the Venezuelan government at that time with the participation of thousands of military people as well as a number of left or kind of clandestine revolutionary groups at that time. It was sort of called a civic military alliance, and it failed. They were able to mobilize a number of people throughout the country, but they were not able to take power. And Chavez in that moment called down his troops under the agreement that he would be allowed to give a televised speech, in which he did give a televised speech and stated that he would call down his troops and that they did not achieve their goals for now. And the kind of the key statement in that was for now, por ahora. And that was sort of what made him, well, first it brought a face to this kind of, to this movement, which inevitably it actually ended up being an incredibly popular attempt at overthrowing that government. By that time, there was incredible disillusion by the government. So Chavez ultimately ends up gaining a tremendous popularity. He gets jailed, goes to jail for a few years, eventually gets pardoned and released. During that time of his being imprisoned, they start to really develop the idea of moving towards an electoral attempt at creating regime change, which they eventually did and formed the MVR, the Movement for a Fifth Republic, which was the initial party through which Chavez participated in the presidential elections in 1998, where he actually did win, and that sort of initiates the whole process that we have now. So I think an important aspect of that doesn't necessarily get talked about as much anymore is this idea of the movement for a Fifth Republic. Kind of the idea of a Fifth Republic was that was actually proposed that had even predated Chavez as well. The idea that there needed to be a new constitution created, upon which they would found a new Fifth Republic. There had already been 4 republics based upon other constitutions in the past. So this idea that in order to create a whole new break with society, with the prior kind of entrenched two-party political system, and there needed to be a new constitution created, which it gets not discussed as much now, but really this idea of constructing a new constitution was very much a galvanizing force, and it was put into place immediately after Chavez took power. In that process, there were participatory assemblies, forums, and things like that held all throughout the country. And finally, a constituent assembly created that kind of gathered all of the various proposals that were put forward by a number of social organizations, citizens, to actually bring all those together to create a proposal for a constitution that then got popularly voted on, and actually won a majority of the vote and was put into place in the year 2000, or was it late 1999? And this was sort of the creation of the new Fifth Republic, a brand new constitution, which proved to be, I think, beyond just sort of like the rhetorical aspects of it, like of creating a Fifth Republic, it actually proved to be an incredibly participatory process. But it also became a platform by which movements were able to establish claims and to actually place their goals upon what they wanted to have represented in the new constitution, and kind of and the goals of what they wanted their movements, of what they wanted seen to take place in their country. And it really proved to be something really significant for many of these movements, from the Afro-Venezuelan movement to the indigenous movement to the women's movement. There were a number of things that were placed in that constitution that really kind of set, I think, a political agenda. And throughout many of the interviews that we did, that was consistently referenced to as something that really kind of consolidated the dreams and the aspirations of these movements, and at the very minimum put them on into a document that was the Constitution, so that they could find legal ways of trying to approach those dreams and aspirations. So this idea of refounding republic, the refounding of a republic, continues to actually be something that movements in their various ways talk about as sort of what they're doing, that we are refounding the republic. For the Afro-Venezuelans, for example, they talk about, in this language is actually in the Constitution, the idea of moving towards the recognition that we are a plurinational and pluricultural republic. And so by that, they mean that Afro-Venezuelan history, culture, and even land rights, historically tied to, what they call cumbés, which is sort of like quilombos in Brazil, where, escaped African slave communities developed communities for years outside of colonial influence, that even those should be recognized. And so the Afro-Venezuelan movement kind of was able to actually get that placed into the Constitution. And we'll get into more of that. And so that's sort of in this idea of the idea of creating a participatory republic and that's the language that the Afro-Venezuelans have adopted and used, and that they continue to use in their movement building work, and in their kind of in their construction of what their proposals and their ideas are. The same goes for the indigenous movement, and actually even more significantly, which is something the Afro-Venezuelans weren't even able to really achieve. The indigenous movement had actually been organizing for a number of years, and had actually been really well prepared for the creation of the national constitution. And this is an important story because it kind of gets into, I think, the understanding that there were movements that had already been organizing for many years. And of course, people don't remember this or know this at all, but that were in many ways already preparing for a dramatic change and simply had seen their opportunity kind of, the new opportunities kind of arrive with the Chavez government. So the indigenous movement is a great example of that, because in the state of Bolivar, which was simply federal territory before Chavez came to power, a number of years before, it changed into becoming a state. And through that process, they had to create a national constitution. In the state of Bolivar, the indigenous people are a large part of the population. And so they were able to actually work through a process of creating a constituent assembly, of actually putting forward proposals for a state constitution. So they had already, by the time the process of creating a national constitution was happening, they were already been prepared for what the kind of things they wanted to see in terms of language placed in the national constitution were. So they were able, and actually this is where Chavez comes in. Through Chavez actually stated that there needed to be a significant quota of indigenous people within the constituent assembly. And this was mandated. And I'm not actually, to be honest, sure exactly how it was mandated, but I think it was about 3 indigenous representatives were to be present in the Constituent Assembly and forming proposals. The result of that was I think, Chapter 8 of the National Constitution, which actually, first of all, simply recognized indigenous peoples in Venezuela in a way that it never had done before. And furthermore, it was a whole chapter that really just that recognized the language, historical, cultural, political, and land rights of indigenous peoples. The Afro-Venezuelan movement has sort of, always talked about that they want to see in further changes of the Constitution, sort of this same parallel thing, that they were able to achieve a certain amount, but not nearly as much as what the indigenous movement was able to achieve. So anyways, all this is sort of a roundabout way to sort of talk about a little bit of kind of what the emerging themes that kind of emerged during, that emerged while we did these interviews. And one of those was this idea of the refounding of republic. And so the constitutional process was sort of a significant element of that. And actually, maybe I can show the video right now just to stop talking so much, which might be helpful to actually start to understand some of these things. And the reason I think it'd be good to show it now is because it has to do with the indigenous movement. And so this video that I like to show is with a group that emerged out of the indigenous movement. It's an amazing initiative called the Indigenous University of Venezuela, which was created by about 9 different indigenous ethnic groups that came together, basically saying that, well, the indigenous constitution now states that we have the right to develop our own education. So that means that we should be able to develop our own university system as well. And so they did this, literally almost right after the Constitution was passed. They began organizing the Indigenous University around the year 2000. And sort of this story, sort of like the excerpt that I read, speaks to, I think, speaks to all these kind of larger themes that emerged. And one of those is this idea of the revolution within the revolution, which is what Herrera de Morocoima talked about in the excerpt I just mentioned, which is the idea that, and also this idea of a dual fight. I think she mentions that too in there, or maybe not. The idea that, well, sort of the theme that consistently, again, emerges is the way that new political opportunities have opened up for many of these social movements. And this is something that I think is really important to speak to. The traditional idea, or the dominant idea that gets kind of created, the image of Venezuela, of course, is of an authoritarian populist kind of government, and where there's a lack of political democracy and these things like that. And I think we found that it's really difficult to try to find ways to explain to people that that's not the case, right? That there's something else happening. And people try to do that in different ways. People try to reference voting, or the communal councils. They talk about all these different things. But we found that the best way to simply do that was to show that there was to simply allow these movements to talk about their movements. And the story that emerges really is that they have found new opportunities for organizing, and likes to which that they have never really seen, at least in their generation. And this is evident in the indigenous movement, in the women's movement, in a number of movements. And at the same time, there's a recognition that in many cases, these same movements that have emerged in many cases as a result of this new transition in government towards the Chavez government, and with the creation of a new constitution, that regardless of the benefits that they've reaped, that there's many times that they actually find themselves having to confront that same government in order to actually push for more demands. And this is sort of this process of the revolution within the revolution that many people actually talk about. It's a very dominant sort of idea that I think is that ties together many of the experiences across social movements that people are dealing with. So sort of this idea, and I think this is also important, that many people talk about, which is that the revolution is not something that will be decreed from above. So people recognize that although a political space has been created, that this isn't something that's simply going to be granted to them. And that, and another great kind of idea that I've heard used, or term that I've heard used a lot, which I think is great, is that Chavez is a tool, and in a good sense. He's a tool in the way that people will use him in order to actually achieve the demands that they have, but recognizing that at the same time that they still need to have a strong degree of grassroots organization and movement development, and so this is something that comes up, I think, throughout all these interviews. And so yeah, I'd like to just show this to give you all a sense of how this relates to the indigenous movement and the indigenous university. Particular.
2% de la población venezolana es indígena. Unas 600 personas de 28.
Damn. Okay, so I didn't get to you guys the one with the subtitles, but I can do that. This is not it.
2% de la población venezolana es indígena. Unas 600 personas de 28 etnias distintas están perdiendo rápidamente sus culturas, tradiciones y costumbres. Cuando se aprobó la nueva Constitución venezolana en 1999, reconociendo el derecho de los indígenas a tener su propia educación, un pequeño grupo de yecuanas, pumés, ñepas y piaroas decidieron aprovechar esta nueva apertura. Fundaron la Universidad Indígena de Venezuela, ubicada a 4 horas en bus y 2 kilómetros caminando de la capital del estado sureste venezolano, Bolívar. En el comienzo, se contó apenas con un par de estudiantes, y ahora, casi 10 años después, la universidad atiende a 70 jóvenes indígenas, representando 7 etnias distintas. Pero este proyecto autónomo es como pocas universidades. Con las aulas debajo de los árboles, los estudiantes están aquí para rescatar su cultura. Esta semana es aún más especial. Es la Semana de Sabiduría Indígena, la época en la que los jóvenes aprenden directamente de los ancianos.
Yo soy de Huirumurero, pertenezco a la etnia yicuana, vengo de sector Alto Cabra, de mi comunidad Bocarecusime, Soriña, estado municipio Sucre, estado Bolívar, ¿no? Y pues estoy aquí pues como estudiando, pues como llevando 4 años y medio, llevando mi formación personal intelectual y también además de esto descubriendo mi identidad cultural como yicuana desde mi pueblo pues.
En esta Semana de la Sabiduría Indígena nos practicamos así igualmente como nuestros abuelos lo han hecho y nosotros seguimos imitando a nuestros abuelos para no perder el conocimiento que ellos hacían.
Vivimos como diferentes etnias, ¿no? También hay yecuana, alma, yaroba, cariña, ñepa, ¿no? Esto también buscamos una convivencia con todos los hermanos. Es una como haciendo como las pláticas, ensayos para que nosotros vivamos, por ejemplo, una sola comunidad para para tener una sola idea, ¿no? Más que todos los pueblos indígenas.
Bueno, aquí estamos enseñando en la selva, ¿no? Y en la selva nosotros aprendemos a hacerle canto de oraciones y cantamos en la naturaleza. Y así nosotros en nuestra comunidad, en nuestras aldeas, cuidamos la naturaleza. Y también utilizamos el material de la naturaleza. Porque con ese comemos, con ese vivimos. De esa manera fue que nosotros enseñamos a estos muchachos que son de esta universidad y de las universidades, de las aldeas de la universidad, traemos acá en la selva y así explicar mucho mejor y viendo las matas y viendo el árbol, y nombrando los árboles y para qué sirven los árboles. Y eso estamos enseñando, ¿no? Bueno, los muchachos les gustan estar acá porque aquí no necesita tener cosas como se usan en la universidad tradicional, pues. Aquí no necesita dinero, aquí se necesita nada más que se llene la cabeza con la sabiduría, con el estudio.
Pues aquí aprendemos de varias cosas importantes, no solamente que aprendes de papel, ¿no? Más que todo área administrativa, en caso de computación, internet, manejo de piscicultura, vivero. Con esas experiencias nosotros tenemos que llevar en nuestra comunidad para que explicarlas por allá, para multiplicar, servir nuestro conocimiento, lo que han aprendido acá en esta universidad.
Por eso nosotros estamos aprendiendo pues, con los ancianos, para que no pierdan mi identidad de más que todo lo que dicen los pueblos pues, en mi comunidad.
De futuro estamos esperando nada más que nos reconozca la universidad. Eso es lo que siempre, o sea, exigimos, pues. Los que estamos acá en la universidad exigimos que el gobierno nacional que nos reconozca nuestra universidad, que sea universidad de verdad, pues, reconocida, porque está sin reconocer. O sea, tenemos un muchacho sin partida de nacimiento, pues. Así estamos ahorita.
Si no hay esa universidad, nosotros vamos a perder totalmente nuestra costumbre. Bueno, más tarde se va a cambiar otra visión, por ejemplo, visión de cultura occidental.
So, yeah. So I forgot to mention, that was a video that I made along with one of the co-authors, Michael Fox. And that is one of the chapters in the book, an interview with a couple people, actually the rector that was in the video and another student from the Indigenous University. So yeah, I think that kind of gives a little bit of a sense of, first of all, one of these very little documented, little known initiatives that are taking place within Venezuela, that of course you'll hardly ever hear about in international press or even national press of Venezuela. And secondly, this idea of sort of these demands these opportunities that have opened up for the indigenous movement, in the form of being able of seeking legal recognition for developing this indigenous university, which they have received some level of support for, but still what they're really looking to get is national recognition, to be recognized as a national university, which would allow them to actually bring more students nationally from indigenous communities from all around the country. I'll get to questions in a little bit. Yeah, Venezuela, I think I actually just returned from a trip in January, and it had been a year since I'd actually been there. I had been living there for 2 years and worked on the book in my second year of being there, and it had been about a year since I had gone back. And to say the least, it's a very complicated political process taking place there. And the future of it, I think, is still really to be determined. But again, I think the point of what we're really trying to do is to move away from these either idealized or demonized visions of what's taking place there, to really ground it in an understanding of that this is still a country like any other in many ways, where communities are engaged in political struggle, and the situation, the context has changed dramatically over the last decade. And I think that's one of the most fascinating things to see. And in the ways that communities' demands have increased and escalated. For me, I think kind of working on this book helped me to understand the political process in Venezuela much more intimately and much better. Because it is easy to kind of get drawn into discussions and debates about what's taking place there as sort of, or this idea that the primary areas of conflict are simply between the government and the political opposition. And political opposition, which is really, the opposition that opposes the Chavez government. Which, it's a whole nother discussion, which I haven't even really gotten into, of what that really looks like. And I know that actually, I think a couple people from the opposition movement have come and spoken here. But which typically, just hold much more, are really just opposed to the Chavez agenda in general. Sort of this idea of socialism, first of all, is not really something that they want. But I think what's interesting to see about the opposition movement in Venezuela, and this indicates sort of, I think in many ways, that the victory, to a certain degree, at least of the discourse of the Chavez government, is the way that the opposition has itself changed its discourse in relationship to the popularity of the Chavez agenda, if not the realities that have been created or that have been changed, but at least of the proposals. So the opposition movement, over the last few years, we've seen it sort of moderate more. And there's been a couple of new parties created that have sort of even talked about themselves as being democratic socialists. It's true of, for instance, Leopoldo Lopez, a prominent opposition figure. We had a meeting with him once, and he described himself as, I'm a democratic socialist. We want to join the fourth or the Second International. And sort of this idea that, so we're not opposed to socialism. We just want it to be democratic. We're not opposed to social programs. And that's sort of a whole nother discussion that I haven't talked about, which is sort of the social programs that the Chavez government initiated in 2005, which are very significant, which I haven't even really talked about at all, or that we don't necessarily get into too deeply in the book, because we assume that people have already heard about these things, but of course many people haven't either. It's sort of the access to universal health care, the educational missions, first beginning with a literacy campaign nationally, then to a high school equivalency kind of program, then to university. And now you actually have an investment in education that's been fairly unparalleled, and I think in Venezuelan history, which is also very significant. And really the opposition has had no, they recognize that that to say that they don't support the Barrio Dentro program, for example, or the right to free education. The Barrio Dentro program is a universal kind of healthcare, basically these clinics that have been created all throughout the country that are part of an agreement between Cuba and Venezuela, where Venezuela provides subsidized oil to Cuba, and the Cuban doctors then work in the barrios in Venezuela. The opposition recognizes that if they were to say that they would not continue with the Barrio Dentro program, that to a certain degree would be a kind of political suicide, that those programs are incredibly popular. So they talk about it, they say that we'll still continue to fund and support these things, we'll just do it better, or we'll be more accountable, we'll be more democratic, or any of those things. I think so for me, it was really significant to move beyond this kind of the traditional idea of what's taking place in Venezuela, simply being a confrontation between the Chavistas and the opposition, because in many ways that's simply not the case, and that's not the only thing that's going to determine. In fact, I think it's less significant in many ways to what will determine the future of the political process taking place in Venezuela. And I think what I really came out of this experience of doing these interviews, really learning, was that in many ways, the future of the political process in Venezuela will really depend upon the way that the Chavez government responds to these social movements and their demands. and whether or not they continue to incorporate the demands of these social movements and open up political space for them to mobilize, or simply ignore them, or contradict them, or repress them, for that matter. And so these are, and the reality is that there's no simple answer for that. People describe Venezuela as being sort of a schizophrenic place, because it's really difficult to tell what is happening there and how to feel about it, because on the one hand you see incredible things that are taking place that actually live up to the political rhetoric of the Chavez government. In other cases, you see things that are taking place that are completely contradicted. And I can speak to this from just having lived there and seeing that. And I think that's the most frank kind of way of talking about it, or describing it. And there's a number of things that have happened recently that I think are important in terms of the relationship between the government and social movements that in some cases are fantastic, and in other cases are troublesome. On the one hand, and when I was in Venezuela in January, the Chavez actually invited people from the Pioneros, the movement that Iraida is from, that I read the excerpt from, to come onto A Lo Presidente, which is Chavez's weekly television show, right? To participate in sort of talking about housing issues in Venezuela. And this was, of course, around the time of the devastating kind of rains that have created a national disaster and unfortunately created a situation where many people have to leave their homes. So he invited the Pioneros to come. Pioneros have already been organizing for a long time. They've had, in some cases, have had their demands responded to, and in many cases have not. And the fact is the Pioneros have been pushing to have in one situation, which Herrera talks about, they tried to occupy a piece of land in a sector of Caracas, which was not in the hills, which was actually within the city, and were driven out by Chavista mayor, the Rangel, I think. Anyways, he they were essentially run out by the cops and all these types of things. They've had major setbacks from their dealings, in some cases even with Chavista officials. So they were invited remarkably by the Chavez government to come onto the show, and they kind of put forward their issues, their arguments, and their demands. And Chavez actually responded by saying, we will provide you with this and this and this plot of land, and it was real, and this and this and this amount of funding to be able to actually allow you all to develop your housing autonomously in the way that you all want to be doing. Because one of the pioneers, one of the groups, that group's main critiques is that the national housing policy still depends, as Herrera was saying in that quote, upon large transnational capital, which is still building these homes without participation of people, and in many cases not doing it in a way that's integral, that's actually that connects transportation and health and all these types of things. It's just sometimes block housing, and does it without people's real organizing efforts. And so what they want to do is kind of insert people into actually doing, for instance, to actually developing their homes. I forget what the word is, sweat equity or something like that, where basically people are sort of participating in the labor of actually creating their own communities. So that was kind of a very significant step for the Pioneros. On the other hand, for instance, in the labor movement, you still have situations where, in more new interesting situations where you have recently nationalized industries. And so, as many people might know, the Chavez government has moved towards nationalizing what it refers to as strategic sectors of the economy. Primarily, this is in food sectors or energy sector, or steel, or things like that. One of these companies, which was accused of hoarding, was Fama de America, which is one of the main coffee companies in Venezuela, which actually, I can pass this around to people. A little bit of that on me, which I think is really interesting. Fama de America coffee, which now many of the products from the recently nationalized companies have this little sticker on it, which is hecho en socialismo, which is made in socialism. Please don't steal it, though. Actually, I have another. This is a piece of chocolate which was created from a recently created, not nationalized, actually recently newly created chocolate factory in the predominantly Afro-Venezuelan part of the country. This is kind of an incredible example, actually, I think, of the participation of communities in actually developing what the Venezuelan government refers to as a socialist factory. Sort of this idea of communities being able to manage factories, run them on their own. This, also hecho en socialismo, was in many ways an amazing kind of example of a collaboration where the government has promoted investment in a national industry like cacao, which cacao, many people don't know, was the primary export of Venezuela before oil was really tapped in Venezuela. So there's a large cacao aristocracy in the eastern part of Venezuela called the Mantuanos, and of course, which received their labor from slave labor, which is why Afro-Venezuelans continue to live in areas where cacao is still grown, actually. And many of those people still work on those plantations. However, the Venezuelan government is not really invested in developing this cacao production for years. So this is sort of an unprecedented, in many ways, kind of example of ways that the Venezuelan government is attempting to implement national production or support national production. I'll pass this through. Fama de America, the bag of coffee I'm taking around, is an example of a nationalized company which, although they're saying that they're happy, they actually demanded the workers in the union and Fama de America that the government nationalize the company. So it wasn't that the government just came in and said, we're going to nationalize it. In many cases, many of these companies have unions within them where the workers had been demanding that because of grievances with their bosses that had not been either paying their pensions or in many cases paying some of, or whatever, had been saying, we want you to privatize it, or we want you to nationalize this. The leader of the union of Fama de America, however, has argued that although they're happy that it was nationalized, that they still haven't been able to participate in co-management of the factory and worker kind of ownership or worker control of the factory in the way that they were promised when it was nationalized. So there's many situations where, and this is not a unique situation. You have a lot of recently nationalized companies in Venezuela that are arguing that, well, we're against capitalists, but we're also against government bureaucrats running it. We as workers want to run this. So there's a number of situations. Those are some of the more recent ones, I think, that are kind of interesting to indicate that it's a little difficult to say in which direction things are going. But it's always exciting to see what's taking place in Venezuela. And I think maybe I can open it up and kind of, we can get into some more of those kind of situations. I think I saw a hand over there first. No, okay, fine. Yes.
Yes, I just wanted to point some of the facts that you mentioned right now that I don't think are completely accurate. The first one is, yes, it is true that the indigenous were recognized by this constitution, and they have right now 3 seats in the Congress, in the National Congress, 3 seats out of 165. Yes, they will be recognized in that way. However, right now it's happening in the south of Maracaibo. I don't know if you have ever been there, but they're pushing the indigenous out of their homes because they want the mineral that is beneath them and sell it to the Russians. So it is true that they were recognized, but however, they don't like the president. And as a fact, I can tell you that yes, 3 seats in Congress are for indigenous, and in the previous election, he won 1, and the other 2, there's still a question about what happened there. The second fact that you mentioned is that Venezuela is investing in education as never before. You should go to universities right now, the public universities in Venezuela, Universidad Central, Universidad Simón Bolívar, which are almost closed right now because they fixed the budget from 2006 until 2010. I mean, they have the same budget, and considering that we have 30% inflation a year. So I don't know where is that money coming, but it's definitely not going to university. And the third one that I don't think is accurate as well is about the quality of Barrio Adentro. Barrio Adentro, yes, it was at the moment a very good program that even the opposition supported, even I myself supported. However, if you go right now to Venezuela, you're going to see that most of them are closed right now. I used to work in healthcare in the public sector, and I can tell you with a lot of support and knowledge that that is not working anyway. And you also are forgetting to mention many things that President Chavez said that I personally consider not democratic, and that's why many people say that. I mean, I wouldn't say it's me. For instance, he was elected for a 5-year period, then he changed the constitution, he extended to 6, a constitution that he created, he changed to a 6-year period, then he changed it again so he can be re-elected all the time. He made a referendum, which he lost, by the way, and then he lost the referendum and he makes another one called the enmienda, and that one he won.
For life now, right?
Yes, I mean, if you make infinite elections, of course you're going to win in one of those. And yes, he has a lot of popular support. I'm not going to say anything about it. He has a big amount of people that are supporting. I don't know how large it is, but the truth is that Leopoldo Lopez, the one you mentioned, which was going to be the main opposite candidate for the next year elections, he cannot run. Why? Because, I don't know, the government says...
Because he was outside of the embassy during the coup attempt against Chavez and was... And because he was actually embezzling money.
The speaker is the first one who interrupt the guy here. So let him speak first, and after that let the speaker respond. I think it's the first.
One more minute and I'll be done, okay? And then you can say anything. The official reason why Leopoldo Lopez cannot run for president next year, well, I mean, this is what the Venezuelan government says, not me, is because there were some administrative issues when he was mayor in Caracas, right? Then I asked, if he stole some money, why he isn't in jail? He's not in jail. I mean, he hasn't had a trial yet, but he cannot run. And the other thing, I think you're forgetting, Hugo Chávez closed the main TV station in Venezuela, RCTV. He has closed more than 200 radio stations. So, especially in rural areas, the only voice that people can hear is Hugo Chávez's voice, nothing else. One more thing, there's a lot of evidence that President Chavez is supporting terrorist groups and also illegal drug cartels in Latin America. I'm not saying this, the Department of State in the United States has said, they show proof, the Colombian government has said, they have proof, and if you want to take more videos, go YouTube and say Chavez supports FARC, which is a Venezuelan, and you want to see videos, a video of him saying that that group should be legalized, something like that.
Yeah. So I don't necessarily, I mean, I feel like what you brought up were, and I don't necessarily want to get into an argument, it's not what I'm here to do, but unfortunately I feel like those are a lot of the rehashed, common, and in many ways false accusations that are leveled against Chavez and Chavez government. And I'm not here to actually even, I feel like, get into arguments about these kinds of things, because in some ways what I'm trying to do is actually create a discourse around how what is happening in Venezuela in all these other ways represents the fact that there is a lively participatory democracy in Venezuela. Outside of any sort of single newsworthy sort of situation, Leopoldo Lopez, RCTV, which all of those are actually highly debatable, and I could debate those with you right now, but I don't necessarily want to, because unfortunately the situation that's taking place is where mainstream media has created, international media has kind of set the agenda about what we talk about when we talk about Venezuela. So RCTV kind of gets leveled as this criticism against the Chavez government, and so here come along all these Venezuela solidarity activists or people that are sympathetic to the Chavez government to try to simply refute that argument, which there's a number of counter articles, and I would just even honestly ask people if they really are interested in this stuff to just go research themselves, because there's articles on both sides, right, of the argument. But what I'm trying to do is to take the debate from all of that to get into just listening to people's stories that are actually participating in the political process in a very different way. And what you mentioned maybe is representative of your story, and I'll appreciate that. But I would implore people, if they really do want to get a much more contextual understanding of what's taking place in Venezuela, to actually just read this book. And that's not just a sales pitch, but that's really just an honest kind of sort of, this is sort of how we wanted to contribute to this debate, to not get into sort of some of these, I think, honestly, typical kind of arguments which are emerging, which are very kind of this and this and this situation, which, you know, you can kind of look at all these and say Chavez is a demagogue, or Chavez is, you know, is this and that, you know. But to actually just listen to people's stories that are participating in these movements, to actually look at, oh, is he really? I mean, you mentioned yourself, the indigenous movement has been able to participate. And one thing that I will refute is this idea that the indigenous movement does not like Chavez in general. I mean, I think that's, I don't know that any single person can actually say whether or not the majority of indigenous people like or dislike Chavez. I can say that there's many issues that the indigenous movement has with the Chavez government. Does not mean that they support the opposition either. And this is the case of Cacique Sabino, for instance, which you can look at that situation, which is, I think, an important situation to look at because it's very conflictive, because it brings up a lot of issues of how the Chavez government has responded to indigenous rights, and actually not responded to indigenous rights as it was stated in the Constitution properly. And yet Sabino doesn't, definitely not campaign for the opposition. He makes that very clear. And then on the other hand, you have situations like the Indigenous University of Venezuela, which is not out there and represents actually many indigenous groups, to say that Chavez government sucks. They're actually trying to get recognition from that government. So, you know, anyways. And then in terms of the media thing, one thing that I do want to mention, actually, and kind of trying to avoid the RCTV situation, because actually it is controversial. And of course, to just give the typical response to that is that the license was not renewed. It was up for renewal. It was not renewed, right? It's not that Chavez just came in and shut it down, but it was not renewed, and that's significant too, and I think it's important to look at. However, on the other hand, what people do not talk about in Venezuela, and this is sort of, I think, one of the most best unkept secrets about Venezuela, unfortunately, is the fact that we've seen, and you mentioned 200 radio stations, which I know that was sort of a story that was going over, but what we've seen is the development of actually hundreds of community radio stations throughout Venezuela, and the development of dozens of community television stations, which are now legally recognized and functioning, many of which that were private, or that were, pirated stations before Chavez came into power. We interviewed a few of those people for the book. One of those people is Katia TV. They had been functioning as a pirate radio station for many years under persecution in the prior to the Chavez government. Now they're actually recognized as a legal community functioning television station. And I just went there actually to visit them in January. And community media, to me, is one of the most exciting things that's taking place in Venezuela, because they're very clear that they're not here to represent simply private kind of opposition-fueled rhetoric or Chavista government-fueled rhetoric, that they're there to occupy a space that is going to call out both of them when they see BS, basically. And literally, I was there at a moment where actually the guy that we interviewed, Wilfredo Vázquez, was saying, we're going to go ahead right now to a demonstration where a community is calling out a local Chavista mayor because he's not following up on these promises that he made. And he's like, the government's kind of pissed at us right now, to be honest, because we're going out and covering some of these situations where communities are protesting some of the Chavista mayors and things like that. He's like, but you know what? That's what we got to do. He's like, we've been provided with this opportunity, with this space, and yes, thanks to this government, but that doesn't mean we're not going to call them out when we have to. And they're pissed at us for doing that, but too bad, you know? It's like, this is what we're here to do. So I think it's important to recognize that this is a more nuanced and complex understanding of how people are actually maintaining accountability to their communities and their barrios or their just communities or whatever. And are in many ways, some of these discussions around RCTV or Leopoldo López are, in the grand scheme of things, pretty insignificant to them. And so I just want to kind of put that out there. That's not why we did this book. You know, we want to kind of explore a much broader understanding of how is democracy looking, what is it, how is it developing, what does it actually look like in Venezuela?
So not on the political realm necessarily at all, but I study Ecuador, and there's a lot of similarities, obviously, I mean, with a lot of the Indian countries, plurinationalism, the new constitution, et cetera, and looking at, like NGO involvement, World Bank funding, stuff like that. I know in Ecuador, at least, there's been a lot of hopping on of international funding to this indigenous organizing that's been going on, to the detriment or benefit of whatever is happening. But there's a lot more funds flowing. It's become a very trendy thing in the international arena to fund indigenous specific programs. So I was wondering if that is the case in Venezuela as well, or if there's any type of hampering. I know that Chavez is not friends with people, or definitely has a polemic, international image. Is that still does that happen in Venezuela as well in terms of international funding supporting the grassroots local development?
International funding from organizations outside of Venezuela supporting?
Yeah, outside of government funding, or where the capital for say the radio stations. I was just reading about a similar project in Ecuador that I think the World Bank was doing. So I see.
That's actually brings up a controversial law that was passed, which I'm actually not necessarily in agreement with myself, which actually, which I understand. I think the impulse, maybe where it came from in the government, of disallowing international funding of in nonprofit organizations within Venezuela. The impulse, of course, came from the fact that you have thousands, millions of dollars in funding coming from government-sponsored organizations, which are allegedly NGOs, which are, of course, funded by, in many cases, the State Department, National Endowment for Democracy, International Republican Institute, the international branches of Democratic National Parties, or Democratic and Republican parties, amongst a number and a wealth of other organizations that are the means by which the U.S. government tries to impose influence within Venezuela, in the same way that it's always done. Nothing really new there, or I don't think controversial about what I'm saying. In the fact, and there has been a lot revealed about the way that the U.S. government has actually even financed opposition journalists in some cases as well. That's been revealed. And this is not at this point really conspiracy theory. So I understand the impulse of where this came from, but I think that it was an extreme measure. That I don't think that the government should be saying that there should not be financing of any NGOs. Obviously, I think that's a little problematic. Yeah.
Yeah. I was curious, how long were you in Venezuela?
2 years.
After being there for, let's say, at least 6 months, or from 6 months to 2 years, did you get a good feeling or a bad feeling about the Cuban-Venezuelan relationship and how the combination of trade and personnel back and forth between the two countries, did you feel was a total good thing for both countries, or did you also see some negatives? And let me tell you on that. I just moved back to Hyde Park after 15 years in Miami. I grew up here. And so I got a whole dose of right-wing Cubanism in Miami. And my feeling about Chavez is he stands separately, and I look at Fidel Castro as somewhat of the equivalent of George Washington. And there's a lot of people in Miami who don't understand that. I mean, to me, the Cuban Revolution was a racial revolution. And in Venezuela, the Venezuelan Revolution would have never happened if all the Venezuelans who live in Miami had stayed there.
Venezuelan Revolution?
Who lived in Miami.
Who lived in Miami.
And there were numerous Venezuelans who kept their money in American banks, mostly in Miami, going back 25 years or 30 years. And the Cubans were doing the same thing with money in American banks in the 40s and the 50s. So my point is that I look at the two countries, Cuba and Venezuela, very, very differently in terms of why they had a revolution.
Okay.
From a racial, ethnic standpoint.
Okay, and the question is my feeling about the Cuban-Venezuelan connection.
Yeah. What did you get out?
Well, I mean, aside from the fact that, yeah, I think there have been problems with the Barrio Dentro recently. I think there's some actual truth to that. I don't think it's necessarily fallen apart, but I've heard that there's problems with it, and it's honestly just difficult to get a read on where things are at with it. And I'll come back, to someone who talked to me about their barrio dentro, and no, there wasn't a Cuban doctor there recently. Oh, but they got a new one recently. Oh, so that's good, and they're back and they're working. It's working again. So it is difficult. But I think.
Did you meet any Cubans that were working in that?
Oh yeah, they're there. They're present. I was attended to by a Cuban doctor. It was great, and medical tourism, it's like actually not a bad idea for some of us to get our dental work done in Venezuela, and I will attest to that myself. I definitely did that before, because I can't really quite afford it here. So that's an important personal anecdote, I think, to mention in terms of the where the Venezuelan healthcare system is at, especially in relation to ours. I think that, it depends on between what Venezuelans and what Cubans, but there's a lot of camaraderie within a lot of Venezuelans and the Cubans, I've had more than one situation where people are like, we've never had this type of medical care, and yeah, it's being provided to Cubans, and it's great. There was, of course, a lot of conspiracy theories that were created around the Cubans first invading Venezuela, and with Venezuelans being opposed to it. A lot of Venezuelans talk about how they were initially afraid of the Cubans and thought they were just going to come to ideologize them and kind of give them Soviet rhetoric or something, and that wasn't the case after all. And but I don't know. That's. So there's been a warming of the Cuban. There's been some of that's happened for sure, and I've definitely seen a level of that. And I think a question that does remain is to what extent Venezuela is going to is and has been, and I think that's important, is investing in developing its own doctors, right? There's been definitely an investment in that, but to what extent that's happening.
More Venezuelans going to medical school, whether it's in Venezuela
yes.
or in Cuba?
Yes, yeah. In fact, there was a international a second kind of ILAM created in Venezuela. Cuba has the Escuela Latinoamericana de Medicina, the Latin American School of Medicine, and there was one created in Venezuela as well. And in fact, I met through that a Guyanese person that had been studying Venezuela. He came from Guyana, was living in a remote part of Venezuela, studying through the ILAM as a sort of the ILAM has a central university, but they were also trying to provide medical opportunities by allowing people to work in barrio dentro. So I can attest to the fact that I've seen people from other countries studying as well in Venezuela. One more question, all right.
Thanks for the presentation. I wanted to hear a little bit more about the union movement, what your understanding of it was. I was aware of the CTV, one of the main union federations, was at least previously very opposed to the Chavez government. I believe it supported the coup. And thinking about the management strike at the Petroleum company. I guess I want to know what's your understanding of the labor movement? Is it supportive of the Chavez government? What percentage of it? Is there a lot of conflict between different union organizations?
Yes.
I don't know if you have any insight on that.
Yeah, it's like everything in Venezuela, complicated, and the relationship between the labor movement and Chavez has been complicated in many situations, and it depends on the tendencia or whatever of the labor movement. So yeah, the CTV, of course, was the traditional labor federation that was really connected to Acción Democrática, the party that was one of the kind of dominant parties before Chavez came into power, and obviously saw the labor leadership, their interests kind of affected when Chavez came into power. That was a long time ago now, and because of that supported the coup attempt against Chavez, the oil strike, which by that time really obviously alienated a lot of laborers, a lot of the rank and file from their leadership. they didn't really understand why their leaders were supporting a coup attempt or an oil strike, for that matter, which was pretty devastating for the country for many months. Which was a kind of a pivotal moment, actually, for many people within the CTV to say, well, the CTV is no longer workable. We need to create our own union, which is what they did. And they created the UNT, the National Union of Workers, which to this day remains incredibly fractured. And there's at least 5 different tendencies that exist within it, with different labor leaders within it, where they all support Chavez, but in different ways, or have different demands. And there's kind of some that are, sort of more what people consider more conservative, in the sense that they are really talking about salary hikes. And there's some that are more radical that are saying, pushing for nationalization of industry and pushing for worker ownership and things like that. There's one of those tendencies, which was a dominant one. There's a dominant labor leader, Orlando Chirino, who was the leader of Secura, which is a pretty dominant labor faction, was a dominant labor faction. He came out against Chavez, and from a very radical place, and basically kind of a very left place, saying that Chavez was anti-worker and all these types of things. And saying that he didn't actually support union autonomy, which I think is potentially true. Chavez has, I think, not necessarily been, has sort of, has not cracked down. He hasn't cracked down on unions, but he's certainly, he's been heavy-handed in his discourse against unions in some situations when they've gone on strike. And this is true of the Caracas Metro Union, which went on strike, and Chavez was not light in his words against them and things like that. So that's why, it's been a complicated relationship. There's we interviewed a couple of different groups for the book, and one of those was the Singatram, which is the new generation of workers union of the Mitsubishi Motor Company. And they, to me, were a really interesting story, because they were in this. They themselves are that history. The leaders of that union were in the CTV, or not the leaders, but the rank and file were in the CTV. They saw that their leaders in their union went through the CTV to support the coup, support the oil strike, and at that time they basically said, no, we need to organize and create a new union, break off from the CTV, forget this. They did that. They called for a mass election. They got the union. They got almost all of the workers, except for the ones that were part of the labor leadership originally, to defect and to create a new union. And now they're sort of in this process of talking about creating a new type of union where it's more led by the rank and file, where they work directly with the communal councils, where they support proposals. They work outside of simply their factory. In terms of demanding, doing collective bargaining agreements, but they also work around, for instance, they're talking about working with the labor unions to create new factories, to do these types of things. So they're a really interesting situation to me of a union that has sort of this very broad vision of what they're trying to do. They're very supportive of the Chavez government. So, however, very critical of various elements. And so this is sort of another thing to go that I didn't even get into, and I don't want to get into too deeply, but sort of what many of these movements, the way that they relate to the Bolivarian Revolution is that they talk about their unending support for Chavez himself, but criticize and say that the problems that are emerging in the process are the fault of those bureaucrats and those people that are under Chavez. And so whether or not that's true, of course, we can debate that all day. You know what I'm saying? And whether or not they do that simply as an act of political strategy is another question too. Because there is a recognition that if they do come out and attack Chavez and come out against him, that they will that they'll alienate themselves from the rest of the political process. And so this is actually what happened with Orlando Chirino. Orlando Chirino from Secura called out, Chavez came out against him. Now he's like a completely marginal figure. You hear nothing about him. There's he went from being like the star of the Chavista labor movement to being really nobody now. So, he's sort of an example of that. But the Mitsubishi Motor Company situation is really important because they occupied the factory in solidarity with non-unionized workers that were in the factory, and demanding that they be absorbed into the union. And they took over the factory, and through that there was actually an attempt to take over the factory again by the owners, and there was actually police that showed up. There was 2, or I believe maybe 3 unionists that were killed, assassinated one day during that occupation. And they blame a Chavista governor for that. They're saying, what was that all about? Why they say that it was the police, they have footage, and why were they there with guns anyways in the first place? That shouldn't have happened. I'm sorry, kind of getting my memory back. And they, they sort of, and they also say that that an issue was that then they were told that the labor by the Ministry of Labor, basically somebody that connected to the Ministry of Labor, that the Ministry of Labor would essentially kick them out of the union, out of the factory, not recognize them as a union if they did not stop their strike. Amidst all of that, which that was a Ministry of Labor person, right, appointed by Chavez, they still maintain that they are in full support of Chavez and the revolution, and that the real issue are these bureaucrats and this and this and that. And so, that sort of, I think, kind of represents some of the complicatedness of all of it. And the union to this day, I think and on this point is that it's still very fractured. And to kind of go back to the last point about amongst the nationalized factories, even you have some major, basically the main kind of banner right now that is being held up by workers within the more recently nationalized factories is that no capitalists, no bureaucrats. And sort of that's what they're saying.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
The World Beyond the Headlines lecture series is a project of the University of Chicago Center for International Studies.
Thank you.
Our nationally recognized programming is made possible with support from the Norman Waite Harris Memorial Fund. Download recordings of other events and learn more about the World Beyond the Headlines series at the Center for International Studies website, cis.uchicago.edu.